Next, we are going to hear from Richard Koo. Richard is an American, but his big message about balance sheet recessions and how they are very specific is shaped by his very long experience in Japan. He told me that Germany, is his toughest audience. He is here in the belly of the beast. He has been evangelizing the Germans earlier today. He says they're starting to listen to him. So let's see if he can persuade us.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. 2 weeks ago, I had to have a one-to-one debate with Mr. Jürgen Stark, formerly of Bundesbank, moderated by Rubini. And this was in Como, Italy, and a lot of people after the debate said, I won the debate. But of course, 80% were Italians, so I couldn't tell whether that was good or that was bad. Then I went to Rome, and I was asked to give a seminar to the Bank of Italy. It was extremely well attended. Materials ran out, chairs ran out. Then I went to Bundesbank. Same thing happened. They expected only maybe 10 people. This is after Easter, of course. Huge numbers showed up. Same thing in ECB. The organizers thought, oh, maybe 10, 15 participants. Much larger participants showed up. Chairs ran out, and so forth. So I'm beginning to sense that something is happening in Germany. And this afternoon, a newspaper wanted me to speak to one of their conferences 1 kilometer away from here to ordinary Germans, hundreds of them. And I'm still alive here. So maybe I'm doing something right. The message I'm carrying is that the Western world has caught the same disease Japan caught 15 years ago. And there are, of course, lots of denials among Western participants that, oh, Japan did everything wrong, we don't have nothing to learn from Japan. Well, I usually start with this chart, which I used in the previous event in INET as well, which shows what happened to Japanese house prices 15 years ago in Osaka and Tokyo areas compared to what's happening to US house prices. And as you can see, both on the way up and on the way down, it's extremely similar. And even those Americans who are loudest with their denials shut up when they see this chart. So, oh my gosh, we didn't know we were that similar. And I have to cut a lot because I was told that I don't have much time. This is what's happening to the monetary policy. I used to work with the New York Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I believed in monetary policy those days. But look what happened after the Lehman shock. The monetary base was increased from 100 to 300, the red line. But money supply, the money available to the private sector to spend, the blue line hardly grew. Credit available to the private sector actually fell during this period. And the bottom line, inflation rate, did not pick up. This is not what we learn in economics. You know, if you triple your monetary base, you're supposed to have much higher increase in money supply, inflation rate picking up, and so forth. Nothing like that is happening. And this is European EU, same story. Bank of England, same situation. And Bank of England, I have to say something a little nasty because they used to say, we're not going to be like the Japanese. We're going to increase monetary base. We're going to have money supply growth, and we're going to get the UK economy going. We're not going to be like the Japanese. That's what Governor Marvin King used to say. Well, we in Japan said, okay, you try it. See whether you can do it. And as you can see, money supply did not grow at all. UK economy is in very sad shape. They had a massive riot not too long ago. And inflation not picking up either. And this is what happened in Japan. Exactly the same story. Massive increase in monetary base, very little growth in money supply, and credit available to the private sector today in Japan is exactly the same level 20 years ago. And of course, we don't have inflation, we actually have deflation. Why do we get this result? Because the private sector is no longer maximizing profits. They are actually minimizing debt. And when you think about it, if the private sector as a group is minimizing debt, money multiplier is actually negative at margin because people used to pay down debt. And if the whole private sector is paying down debt, banks cannot relend the money that is coming back to them. The deleveraged funds coming back to them cannot be loaned out if the private sector as a group is paying down debt. So no matter what central bank does on a monetary base, it's very difficult to get the money supply to increase. And if money supply cannot be increased, you're not going to get much push out of your monetary policy. And that's the result you saw earlier. Oh, sorry. If you look at this chart, this shows how much money Japanese companies procured from both the banking system and the capital market. And during the bubble days, you can see there's a huge increase in the procurement of funds. Then the bubble burst, you see demand for funds falling. And Bank of Japan, the other line is the Bank of Japan's 3-month CD rate. And by 1995, 3-month CD rate is almost down to zero. And see what happens afterwards. Even with zero interest rates, corporate demand for funds goes into negative, meaning companies all pay down debt. And we never learn in business schools that companies are supposed to pay down debt when interest rates are zero. But that happened in Japan full 10 years. It's happening all over the world today, all over the Western world today. Why is it? Because all the assets they bought during the bubble days collapsed in value, but the liabilities remain, so their balance sheet's underwater. The balance sheet's underwater means these guys are bankrupt. But there are two types of bankruptcies. The usual type is that the main line of business doesn't do very well and you run out of cash. But the other type is that you still have income, you still have revenue, you still have cars and cameras selling, but your balance sheet is underwater because of the silly decisions management made during the bubble days. And in that case, what is the right thing to do? Your balance sheet is underwater, you have cash flow. Well, it doesn't matter whether you're German, Taiwanese, Japanese, or American. What you do is use the cash flow to pay down debt. Because that way, you don't have to tell your shareholders it's all a piece of paper now. You don't have to tell your bankers it's all non-performing loans. And most importantly, you don't have to tell your workers you have no more jobs tomorrow. So for all the stakeholders involved, that's the right thing to do. But when everybody does it all at the same time, what happens to the national economy? For national economy to function, if there's someone saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money. And in the usual world, financial types, like myself, are in the middle, taking the money from the savers, giving to the borrowers, and make sure that all the saved funds are borrowed and spent. That's the whole function of the financial market. And if there are too many borrowers, rates are raised. Too few borrowers, rates are lowered. Make sure all the saved funds are borrowed and spent. But what happens in that world, the circled part, where people are not borrowing money even at zero interest rates, and they're not borrowing money because their balance sheet is underwater, then there will be no lenders to these guys who are bankrupt, and those people who have balance sheets underwater are trying to come out of that as quickly as possible. And when you're in that situation, all the saved funds coming into the banking system cannot leave because there's no borrowers even at zero interest rates. So if you don't do anything to this situation, the economy will lose demand equivalent to the money stuck in the banking system every quarter. And soon enough, you enter Great Depression. And that's exactly how U.S. entered Great Depression from 1929 to 1933. Everybody was paying down debt. No one was borrowing money. And United States economy lost 46% of GDP in just 4 years because of that process. In Japan, we had the same experience. Some of the debt repayment were over 10% of Japanese GDP. And Japan could have lost 10% of GDP every year during that period. We managed to keep our GDP above zero for the entire period because how did we do it? Government borrowed the money. If government borrow the money and spend it, you can keep this income circulating. And Japan's GDP, as you can see, never fell below the peak of the bubble, even though Japanese commercial real estate prices fell 87% nationwide. Now for you people in Germany, try to imagine Berlin prices down 87, Dresden down 87, Osnabrück down 87, Stuttgart down 87, München down 87. What kind of economy you think have left in Germany? Japan managed to keep its GDP at above the bubble peak for the entire 20-year period with massive private sector deleveraging and asset prices down 87% with this fiscal spending. So I would argue that when you're in this type of recession, which happens only after the bursting of the nationwide asset price bubble, government has to be in there to make sure that all the leveraged funds are put back into the income stream again. Then, this lesson was actually learned by G20 countries in that they all did that fiscal stimulus 2009. And that was all successful, but there was another part of the Japanese experience that I don't think is fully understood in this part of the world. This shows what happened to Japanese tax receipts and the Japanese budget deficit. And the purple lines are budget deficit, white lines are tax receipts. And in 1997, against my best advice, Prime Minister Hashimoto listened to IMF, OECD, those people who know nothing about anything, told Japan that, Japan is building bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere, you have an aging population and economy going nowhere. Why don't you cut your budget deficit? And I told the Prime Minister, no, you don't cut now. If you cut, the whole thing will come crashing down. But he listened to all these big shots from around the world, raised taxes, cut spending, and guess what happened? Economy entered 5 quarters of negative growth, complete breakdown in the banking system, and our budget deficit increased by 68%, as you can see. Tax receipts fell, budget deficit increased, and it took Japan 10 years to climb out of that mistake. Now you look around the world today. If the US, UK, everywhere around this part of the world, government is trying to put in austerity measures when the private sector is minimizing debt. And I think that is the cause of all the tragedy in Spain, Ireland, and Portugal. Well, not necessarily in Greece. And Greece, I'm afraid, is not in balance sheet recession. But this is the case in the United States. This is the flow of funds for the US. I don't have much time to explain the chart. But if you, there are 4 lines here. These 4 lines are supposed to add up to 0. Household sector, corporate sector, government sector, and the rest of the world sector. And above 0, other people saving money. Below 0, other people borrowing and investing money. And these 4 lines are supposed to add up to 0. That's how these charts are put together. And if you look at during the bubble days, American households, corporates, they were borrowing money like crazy. Where are they now? They're well into the positive range. The heavy blue line and the dotted red line, fully into the positive range at 0 interest rates, which means they are in the exact position the Japanese were in starting 1995. And it's no wonder that they cannot increase money supply even with all the monetary easing, all the quantitative easing, Operation Twist, whatever. They cannot increase money supply when the private sector is deleveraging like this at 0 interest rates. This is the same picture in the UK. Corporate sector was above 0 from the beginning, but after the bubble, it increased savings massively. And, household sector, which was borrowing money, are now paying down debt as well. So UK is squarely in balance sheet recession, where private sector minimizing debt at near 0 interest rates. As a result, interest rates in those countries fell to very close to Japanese levels, near 2%, where Japanese bond yields were in 1997. And this is not a bubble. The bond yields coming down to these low levels in balance sheet recession is what you expect during the balance sheet recession. Because when you put yourself in a position of a fund manager, and if you're in the UK, US, Japan, or anywhere outside the Eurozone, and if you're in this situation, and if you have certain requirements that you cannot put all your money in equities, that you have to have some money in bonds, that is, and you cannot take too much foreign exchange risk, and the private sector as a group is deleveraging, where can you put your money? The only place left is the government bonds. That's why during the balance sheet recession, government bond yields come down to these ridiculous low levels, because that's the only place, that's the last borrower standing. Then the 100 billion euro issue is, why is this not happening in the Eurozone? This is the Eurozone bond yields, as you know, they're all over the map. Now, I said Greek is not in a balance sheet recession. I'm afraid they really screwed up themselves. I can't say too much for them. But for the other countries, if you look at the Eurozone as a whole, you see that heavy blue line and the dotted red line well above into the positive range at the lowest interest rates in modern European history. So Eurozone as a whole is in balance sheet recession. Then you look at Spain, same picture, very huge borrowing during the bubble days, now well into the positive range. Ireland, even Portugal. Even in the Portuguese case, the corporate line is still below 0, but significantly less 0 than they were during the bubble days. And the household sector, of course, increasing savings. How come the bond yield in those countries are not coming down at least to the UK level, if not to the US level? Because US and UK both have huge trade deficit, current account deficit, as well as a budget deficit, just like Spain, Portugal, and Ireland. Well, there's a key difference, and this is the key problem in understanding the euro problem, and that is that if you're a fund manager in Spain, and if you're faced with the same requirement that you cannot put all your money in equities, you have to have some bonds, and you cannot take too much foreign exchange risk, and the private sector is not borrowing money, as you saw here, the private sector is not borrowing money at all, do you have to buy Spanish government bonds? The answer is no. You don't have to buy Spanish government bonds. You can buy German government bond, the Dutch government bond, and Finnish government bond. And when people see this large budget deficit in Spain, and people who have nothing better to do talk about these budget deficit problems, then fund managers get scared. Oh my gosh, maybe we should move our money to Germany. But as the money leaves Germany, what happens to Spanish bond yield? It goes up. When it goes up, the Spanish government panics. Says, oh my gosh, we have a funding problem, sovereign debt crisis. So then they have to cut their budget deficit. But private sector is deleveraging. If the government delever at the same time, they're making the exact same mistake Japanese made in 1997. So the economy gets weakened, the economy weakens, and when the economy weakens, investors panic even further. Oh my gosh, there's no way this kind of Spanish economy can pay us back. They move the money out further, and the situation just gets worse and worse and worse. I'm afraid that's the problem in Spain and in other peripheral countries. I was in Spain middle of November last year, and Nomura gathered all these major institutional investors into one room, and I was giving this talk. I thought it was a great opportunity to ask the Spanish investors what they're doing. So I asked them, how many of you moved money from Germany to, from Spain to Germany? I was shocked. Everybody raised hands. Everybody. And they kind of looked at each other and said, oh no. So when you have this very easy movement of capital in and out, just like that in the Eurozone, and this is nothing new. 5 years ago, the flow was going the opposite direction. French banks, German banks, all moving money to peripheral country government debt because they were offering higher yield because they had a bubble. And they don't have to incur foreign exchange risk, they don't have to incur principal risk, and they got higher yield. So that was the capital flows into those peripheral countries. But once the bubble burst, the money flew out just when the countries needed the money most. And unless something is done about this problem, this crazy capital flows that can happen only inside the Eurozone. It doesn't happen in UK, it doesn't happen in Japan, it doesn't happen in the US, but it happens in the Eurozone. This is something that the Eurozone, the people who created the Euro never had a chance to address, but never anticipated. And there's one other fundamental problem in Eurozone is that if you look at the Spanish numbers, flow of funds data, if you add the private sectors together, corporate sector and household sector, it's over 6% of Spanish GDP. So at near zero interest rates, Spanish private sector is saving 6% of GDP. If the government is only allowed to borrow 3% of GDP, which is in the Maastricht Treaty and in the new fiscal compact, what are you going to do with the remaining 3? There is no provision in the Maastricht Treaty for the remaining 3 because something like this was not supposed to happen. Private sector is not supposed to pay down debt when interest rates are 0. In the past, it happened, of course, you can see some private sector numbers above 0, but that was with a very high interest rates, positive interest rates. But never at 0 interest rates, private sector lines above 0 in such a significant way. Unfortunately, when Maastricht Treaty was negotiated, no one outside Japan knew anything about balance sheet recession. And this was never taught in universities. Only in the INET meetings you get to hear this thing, because this is a new economic thinking. So they put together these rules, assuming that something like that will not happen. But once every several decades, when private sector, which is usually careful people, do lose their discipline and they go crazy. And when that happens, once every several decades, then you fall into this recession called balance sheet recession. Then you need fiscal stimulus to address these issues. Now, she's telling me to shut up. So I won't get into my solution because it would take a little more time to explain the solution. But there is a solution. I just wanted to tell you that what we learn in universities, all assuming private sector maximizing profits, is actually only 1/2 of the economics. And once the bubble bursts, which is on the top of this chart, once the bubble bursts, we fall into a situation where private sector is minimizing debt. Then you fall into a balance sheet recession, you need fiscal stimulus, and even after balance sheets are repaired, people will not be willing to borrow money because they're so traumatized by that experience. That's basically the situation in Japan today. Corporate balance sheets are the cleanest in the world. No one wants to borrow money because of the horrible experience that they just went through. And then you have to overcome that, and then you come back to the normal textbook world where they are actually maximizing profits. And that's the white areas. I call it the yang area against the in area. And all we learn in universities is the the light part, the in part, where private sector is maximizing profits, they respond to interest rate signals from the central bank, monetary policies are effective. In that world, fiscal policy is the bad thing to use. And I fully agree with all the neoclassical economists who argue that fiscal policy is a bad thing to use. But when you're on the other side, when private sector is minimizing debt because their balance sheet is underwater, everything we learn in universities, I'm afraid, go out the window because the fundamental assumption is no longer met. Then we have to reconstruct that part of economics based on the assumption the private sector is minimizing debt. And that's what the word I call balance sheet recession. And I'm happy to tell you that now, thanks to George Soros' effort of the INET, it has gone out quite far, but not fully in Germany. And so if you could spread the message, I appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, thank you, Richard, for a very brilliant presentation. I'm grateful to you for the self-sacrifice of going straight from slide 20 to slide 43. And everyone, really, it was a brilliant presentation, wasn't it? Please download it from the INET site. You can read it on the flight home, and better still, you can then buy Richard's brilliant book to get the full story. So thanks a lot.